The winter wind had teeth that year, and it took pleasure in finding the weaknesses of roofs and seams. It scoured Crow's Rest from the ridge where the pines leaned like sentinels to the river flats that lay pale and flat under the sky. The inn on the hill, a squat, stubborn place of stone and hand-hewn beams, was the only light on the road for miles. Its windows glowed like warm, watchful eyes, and inside, a rumble of stove and voices kept the cold from settling into bones. Mary Beth Cooper moved through that small warmth with an economy of motion she had learned early. Quick hands, no wasted step, the kind of competence that looked unremarkable until someone watched long enough to see how hard she was making it all look. She stacked plates, brushed crumbs into her palm, and swept them into her apron. She braided hair into a neat coil for a guest who would never notice. She tended the inn as if tending a visible, fragile trust, and for the most part the town of Crow's Rest let her tend it, because that was how things were done in such places. The innkeeper's daughter did the inn. She kept a small collection of books beneath the bed in her room, battered things with cracked spines and anxious pages, and a leather-bound journal whose corner was rubbed soft from use. At night, after the last lamp in the parlor had gone out, and the talk of men who came for shelter drifted into snores, she would open the journal and write. Pages filled with lists at first, bread for the morning, nails for the door, and then small fragments that grew tenderer and coughed like a thing waking. She wrote not as a woman with great speeches, but as one who gathered words the way one gathers kindling, to start a little, steady fire. She had been keeping words for herself for 2 years, since the afternoon that sat at the center of her memory stone in still water. The town remembered it in whispered translations, the way a story loses its exact details but keeps its ache. Thomas Whitmore called her forward at the market square, loud enough for every ear, and made a jest from the way her dress settled about her. It had been an almost polite cruelty, the kind that looked like a jibe but lands deeper. Men laughed, some thinking it no more than sport. Others exchanged looks and walked away. The sound of that laughter had hooked itself to Mary Beth's bones. After that day, she learned every face when it turned toward her, how to lower her eyes before they sharpened to judgment. That humiliation had not been the first time she'd been measured against a standard she did not fit, nor would it be the last time the town's shorthand would define her. But it had been the moment she decided to give what she could without demanding the world let her take more. If the world would weigh her by appearance, she would fortify herself with other measures. She would, for one, keep words close. She would practice small mercies and the work of the hands until the town could not easily reduce her to a single shameful name. She kept her strengths private. At the inn's bar, she laughed when jokes landed and poured whiskey without letting the glass rattle. The regulars would never suspect that Thomas Whitmore's joke had tilted light from the rest of her days. Not outwardly. People were quick to carry tales, slower to notice the quiet, private repairs a person made to their heart. On the afternoon the storm broke, Mary Beth sat at the inn's low table, writing a line in her journal about a torn glove she'd mended. Snow arrived like gray ash, feathered at first and then driving, hurrying across the yard as if with a destination. The trees bowed, the bell above the inn's door trembled, and the few travelers still on the road fought the wind with stout steps. She heard the boot on the stoop before she saw the man. He came in like a shape made of the mountain itself, broad shoulders, a coat more patch than cloth, a face that had been weathered into a map of scars and sun. He shook snow from his hair and boots and stood, looking as awkward in the bright domestic light as a young colt at a barn feast. He had hunted on his own terms for years, and the ways he claimed his living were read into the lines by those who watched. A flint crease on his cheek, a burn ringed like a small moon along his jaw. There was a kind of dignity in the way his hands were set. Even when his fingers trembled with cold, they were capable hands. He took up a stool at the corner table, removed his gloves, and set a small bag beside his knees. He ate in grateful bites when Mary Beth put down a bowl of stew. He did not make idle conversation. When he glanced around, his eyes seemed to be measuring the room for place and purpose, as if deciding whether he belonged to this kind of warmth. There was a watchfulness to him that had little to do with distrust, and more to do with surprise at being invited in. Mary Beth cleaned plates while he ate, and when he reached for the bowl, his hand knocked a small book from the shelf behind the counter. It clattered to the floor, pages fanning like a startled bird. He flinched as if the sound were a blow, and then he recoiled from the book the way some men recoil from an animal. Mary Beth paused, broom in hand. The other patrons glanced, more curiosity than concern in their faces. The man's jaw worked. He did not offer the well-worn smile of a gentleman embarrassed by his own clumsiness. Instead, he looked at the book the way a man might look at a mirror that had long presented only shadows. Mary Beth's heart opened in a small, certain way. She stooped, retrieving the book, feeling the weight of the pages in her palm. It was a primer of simple sentences and pictures of animals pressed into the corners. She had repaired edges like these more than once. She handed it to him with the ease of someone who returns what is expected.
"Not many of our folk keep books close to hand," she said, as if remarking on a lamp left outside. She found her voice steady. There was no pity in it, only an acknowledgement. The man did not answer at once. He took the book, fingers hovering as if unsure whether the paper might cling to him. "Where are you from?" she asked, wanting to make the moment ordinary. "Up the Ridge," he said. "Boone, Elias Boone." His name was a thing with a soft thud that fit the way he carried himself. He said very little else. He ate, and the inn resumed its low hum. That night, when the gale tightened and the inn's windows rattled like distant drums, Mary Beth found herself thinking of the man and the way his hands had trembled at the book. She did not sleep well. It is a subtle thing to find yourself wondering about a stranger's private lack, and yet too human to ignore. She had always believed words were a companion that could be learned in private. She had taught herself from other books and held them like a map out of loneliness. The thought of someone so near, a mountain man with hands that could skin a deer and build a snow shelter, who had never learned to read, made something in her shift. At dawn, the inn stove was a steady beast of warmth and whistle. Men spilled in to dry gloves and boots. Elias lingered with his back to the window, eyes on the way Mary Beth arranged the cups. When she moved to refill a kettle, he stepped closer in a way that made her notice the distance between them. He did not ask for bread. He did not press a request. Instead, he looked at her bookshelf, then at the primer she had placed near the stove the night before. He made a small, awkward gesture, the kind that belongs to someone unfamiliar with the softer manners of a room where others live. He began, and then stopped. Words snagged in his throat. Mary Beth found herself smiling, a small relief, because the absence in his voice was not lack, but a plea, and she understood pleas. "You're welcome to it," she said, and she added, before she could think herself out of it, if you'd like me to help." The offer came out sharper than she intended. She had not told anyone in the town that she mended old books like quilts, nor that she taught running lists of letters to children who stopped by for bread and lessons. It had been an indiscreet little talent, but she had not expected to offer it to a man whose life had been carved by the mountains. Yet there it was, and Elias blinked as if the warmth had surprised him. "Teach me?" he repeated, the syllables slow, like a hand testing a hot pan. "Letters first," she said. "A, B, C. Not much to it. Chalk, slate, if you want." He looked at his hands. "I never learned," he said simply. There was no apology in it. It was a fact, a plainness laid out like a folded coat. Mary Beth's mouth moved. She felt the old ache of being measured, and then something steadied, a teacher's certainty that a small rhythm could change much. She thought of the way words had authenticated her in private, how a line written in the journal could be a small, stubborn proof of her own existence. If she could pass that to another, it would be a way of being useful in a way that mattered. "Tomorrow," she said, "after chores, we'll start with the letters." The man nodded. There was gratitude in it, simple and immediate, and then the rain of conversation resumed around them, and the moment settled into the day. Mary Beth told herself she would keep the lessons quiet. There was no reason to parade the man's ignorance through the town square. Some things were not charity. They were common humanity, and ought to be treated with discretion. But Crow's Rest did not always keep secrets as carefully as one might hope. People watched, and stories found small mouths to carry them. Mary Beth herself wondered, as she laid the primer on the kitchen table and cleared a place for him, whether the town would call it another notch in the ledger already balanced against her. She was, in many eyes, still the girl Thomas Whitmore had ridiculed. To them, any association with someone outside the polite lines, a mountain man with a rough beard, would only confirm the shape they have ascribed. She did not welcome that. Still, the work had its own gravity. The first lesson was a domestic choreography, slate warmed by the stove, chalk dust settling in the soft air. The primer opened to a picture of a cat with stiff, awkward strokes. She drew a large A on the slate, strong and deliberate, and then smaller, showing the motion of the hand. Elias watched like a man watching how another person sews a seam. His fingers twitched with a readiness that was not obvious at first glance. "Say the letter," Mary Beth said. "A," he said, the sound like he had been holding it in his mouth, unused.
They went through the letters slowly. His hand at first was heavy and uncertain. He gripped the chalk as if it were a hunting tool. Mary Beth moved his fingers with a gentleness that was not soft so much as firm, the kind of touch that says, "I trust you to hold on." The small victories came. A neat B, a crooked C that leaned like a tree after a storm but was honest in its tilt. He laughed once, a quick, startled sound when he formed an M well enough that it looked almost like an attempt. Their first week passed under the small discipline of alphabet. Mary Beth scheduled lessons around her other work, slipping between the hours of breakfast bustle and the late-night inventorying of stores. Elias came and went with the steadiness of a man whose life was not measured by clocks. He cleared snow from the inn's path one morning and left a parcel of rabbit meat hanging in gratitude on the rear post. Another day, he had taken a small chair from the back shed and repaired its loose leg. He brought the rawness of the mountain, fur, smoked meat, the smell of cold leather, and he traded it for bread, for stew, for the slow muscle of shared labor. There were moments that felt like prayer without words. Once, after they had practiced long vowels until their voices sounded almost foolish, Elias sat back and read the simplest phrase she had written on a scrap of paper. The cat sat. He sounded out each syllable, slow as a man coiling a rope, and when he reached the last word, he smiled. It was a quiet smile that belonged to a man who had found at last that a rusty tool could be made useful. The other patrons at the inn paid it no mind. They were used to seeing miracles of a different sort. A pie that rose, a saddle mended. This was a quieter kind. Mary Beth felt danger then, too, the small, electric thrill of seeing someone change near you. It made her aware of how easily one could be unmade by hope if that hope was not returned. She remembered Thomas Whitmore's laughter, and the way the town had felt like an eye ready to unpick whatever confidence she'd stitched into herself. She resolved to keep the lessons modest as a belt around the waist, snug but not visible to the onlookers who measured people in passing. For Elias, learning was a kind of rediscovery. He possessed a sharpness of observation that had nothing to do with letters. He could see a trail's disturbance a day after a man had passed, could read the wind's change by the way a pine limb trembled. Illiteracy had never been a sign of dullness. It had been, rather, a circumstance, a place left unwalked in the map of a life. He had learned other languages, the language of prey, the grammar of season, the subtle navigation of a cliff's promise. Words behaved differently. They required submission, a discipline of the mind that was foreign to a life moved by muscle and weather. He made mistakes at first that made him impatient with himself. He would write a letter and then, seeing its crookedness, press too hard and tear the paper. Mary Beth chastised him gently, teaching the right touch with an old woman's impatience shaped into tenderness. She showed him how to fold his wrist, how to let the hand move as if it were guiding a bird. The chalk dust gathered at the edge of his nails, and sometimes he rubbed it off with the sleeve of his coat, blushing as if learning were a shame. When Elias shared pieces of his past, he did so like one who gently unseals a jar, cautious, measured. He told her of an absentee mother crushed beneath the weight of hard seasons, of a father whose idea of instruction was hammer smooth, a palm against a cheek that taught fear more often than love. He did not tell the most bitter things in full. Mary Beth drew those out with the patience of someone who has learned to notice when silence carries a load.
There were nights he slept in the loft, and in the morning Mary Beth sometimes found him awake and stitching fur with fingers transformed by the day's lessons into a soft tenderness. She watched him, learning not just letters, but how grief sits in a man's back, how pride is a shield that does not always keep the heart from cracking. News of the lessons moved like a small current through Crow's Rest. It began as a filament of curiosity. Did you see Elias Boone sitting with Mary Beth? And expanded into speculation and appraisal. Mrs. Kelton, whose gossip had the keen edge of a woman with nothing else to do, commented loudly enough at the market the innkeeper's daughter was indulging in charity she could not afford. People judged, as people always do, and when there is nothing else to measure a human by, they measure by appearance, by a single public moment that is easy to recall. Mary Beth felt the town's eyes in a new way then. She had not minded physical labor or the rough estimate of men. She minded the reduction, the way a single jest could rewrite a life in a sentence. She thought of the small life she had gathered, the books under the bed, the journal in which she wrote a new sentence each night, the spare coins hidden under a loose plank. She straightened in the kitchen and continued to cook. She taught Elias to write and closed the door on what she thought mattered. There came an afternoon when Thomas Whitmore himself arrived at the inn, swaggering as if the weather had contrived to be his ally. He had heard about Elias and the lessons, and could not resist expectation of a spectacle. He took up a corner near the stove with a movie of interest that was all showmanship and little curiosity. His friends nudged him, trading the kind of smirks that gather around cheap entertainment. "Teachin' the mountain man to read?" one of them asked, as if to confirm that a lark had begun. Mary Beth felt the color rise to her chest, a stubborn heat that carried equal parts anger and shame. She set down a plate with steady hands and met Thomas's eyes for a moment only, then looked away. There was a small human truth. The presence of certain men in a room turned any act of kindness into provocation, and kindness thus became fragile, easily snatched from the hands of the giver. Elias, who had been practicing a line of letters, put down his slate and did not look up. He had, in some things, the instinct to avoid explosions. He waited as if he had been trained to weather storms without noticing the roar. He sipped his stew, face shaded by a beard that did not hide the clarity in his gaze. He was learning to read and being read at the same time. Mary Beth decided then to be small in public and steady at home. When the inn's chatter rose to a level that would encourage gossip, she slipped him a bread and sent him off early with a shrug. The lessons continued, but now always with an extra sense of caution.
She had wanted to be a teacher in quiet dignity, to pass on a tool that made life more navigable. She had not wanted to be a spectacle. If these kinds of stories appeal to you, a quiet life mending itself in strange company, and you like being carried along by small, human transformations, stay with this telling a while. There is room here for slow warmth. The weeks after the storm folded out like a series of small domestic vows. Elias learned the alphabet solidly. It began to connect in his head with things he already knew. A was not merely a mark, but the head of a word that could be used to call a dog or to begin a name. He learned to sound out words by pointing to letters like stones across a river, until he could combine them into a sentence. Mary Beth's practice sheets multiplied in a mild tyranny of corrections. She kept them tucked into a tin box beneath the mattress, a record of progress that she considered sometimes with the curiosity of a mother. They built a ritual out of the lessons. Mornings he would come in early to split kindling while she swept the hearth. Mid-afternoons they'd sit at the round table, slate and primer between them, and the inn's light would lean on their shoulders. The act of teaching required a calm, measured voice. Mary Beth found that in herself, and the words she used often stuck to her like a second skin. "Match the sound," she would say. "Trace with your finger first." Elias accepted the small humiliations of learning with the stoicism of a man who had known rougher shames. When he misread a word, he would put his hand to his mouth and shake his head, all long, low exasperation, then start again. The progress had practical consequences. Elias, once limited to the perimeters of his mountain life, began to read labels on feed sacks and signs nailed to post. He took on odd jobs with more speed because directions no longer remained a mystery. When Mrs. Kelton needed a note left at the general store, he offered to take it. The note itself was unspectacular. "Leave 20 pounds of flour with the Cooper place." It was the manifestation of trust that mattered to Elias, the trust that someone might give him a small task not merely to test him, but because they believed he could do it. Mary Beth watched him in these minor triumphs with a mixture of pride and an intimate thrill she had not named. He would come home with his coat smelling of tar and the river, a small paper tucked into his pocket like a hunted thing. He began to read things aloud for himself, letters pronounced into the air in the kitchen while dough rose on the counter. A phrase here and there began to attach to turns of thought, and he started haltingly to form sentences that spoke of the day. One evening, when the wind eased and the inn's windows held the pale of a long winter dusk, Elias took the primer in his hands and wrote a short word on a scrap of paper. He held it out with a gravity that made the room seem suddenly very full. "Read it," he said. Mary Beth took the scrap. The ink scrawled a word awkwardly, C-A-T. The letters were uneven, the A a little too narrow, the T leaning. It looked like a thing carved in a hurry. She smiled, because the sight of it carried the weight of a small arrival. "S-at," she prompted softly. "Cat," Elias said. His voice had a roughness to it that seemed to make the word solid. He leaned back as if he had set something heavy down and discovered it was not a weight, but a living thing that would remain. They celebrated with a modest slice of pie, and then returned to the tide of ordinary life. The town continued to rotate its judgments like planets. Some regarded Elias's slow ascent with suspicion, as if a mountain man who could read might be more dangerous than one who could not.
Others spoke to Mary Beth with a new politeness, less daring perhaps because the act of teaching had revealed a tenderness they could not effortlessly mock. During one of the quiet afternoons, Mrs. Kelton arrived at the inn with the deliberate tread of a woman on a mission. She had heard about the lessons, as gossip will do, and she carried in her hand the small utilitarian look of a person who knew how to get attention. She sat at the table and fixed Mary Beth with an expression that was careful and calibrated. "You'll have to be careful," Mrs. Kelton said, the words soft but edged. "People will talk. Folks don't easily forgive changes in what they expect." Mary Beth felt warmth rise but kept her face neutral. "We meant it for the right reasons," she replied. "He's a good man." Mrs. Kelton pursed her lips. "Good for some things, perhaps, but the town has eyes. There's Thomas. You know how they like to sip their stories." Mary Beth heard more than the woman said. She heard the town's appetite for neat stories. She knew how easily a life could be summed up. An innkeeper's daughter who took pity, a mountain man who was saved by a gentle woman. It would flatten them into a pleasing tale and leave out the small complexities. Elias's half-made jokes, the careful way Mary Beth arranged herbs to dry, the way they both learned how to put their hands where a kindness would matter most. In the kitchen that night, when the light was low and the stove sent up a contented heat, Elias looked at Mary Beth with an ease that had settled between them. He was still a man of few words, but he had begun to keep a small journal in his own crude hand, a leather thing with blank pages given to him when Mary Beth saw a chance to make him a gift. He wrote not of big thoughts, but of small facts. Snow came, cut wood, read cat. He would fold the page and tuck it into his coat as if it were evidence that the world had shifted a minute. Mary Beth, too, kept a small scrap of writing, torn from the journal she preferred to hide. On some nights she would take it to the window and reread the sentence, savoring its private meaning.
The phrase was not an elevated sentiment. It was a fact she allowed herself. "I teach because I remember what it felt like to be unseen." The memory of that feeling carried a gentle ache, and often, bending over a page beside Elias, she felt some of that ache lighten. Their days began to inhabit a private rhythm that the town could only observe in fragments. They traded gifts in the way of two people building a life: a parcel of dried venison left at dawn on the inn step, a loaf of bread tucked in Elias's pack. They learned practical things for each other. Mary Beth showed Elias how to mend a seam so it would not ride, how to set a jam to the right boil without it burning the bottom of the pot. Elias taught Mary Beth the names of tracks in the snow, how a fox's line of travel differs from a hare's. These exchanges were not, to either, romance in any bright dramatic sense. They were the sort of companionship that is compiled out of usefulness and respect. Two people each making the other capable in the things that matter to daily living. Yet there was also a gentleness that would only be called love if one were willing to risk naming it. They ate at the table with elbows almost touching, and Mary Beth found herself watching the way the light caught the scar beneath Elias's eye. It was not the scar she thought about, but the way his mouth softened when he was listening. Elias watched the small things about Mary Beth as well, the way she tucked stray hair behind her ear, the way she hummed when kneading bread, the gentleness with which she handled the pages of his crude journal. Still, the town's murmur did not vanish. There were passing remarks that were intended to sting. "I suppose the mountain man needs a civilizing hand," someone snorted. At the general store, a boy passed a note that said, "Ask Mary Beth if her charity comes with a dowry." Thomas Whitmore laughed in corners and did not hide the pleasure he took in the discomfort of others. Mary Beth learned to breathe through such days, to keep her face like stone and her resolve soft but imperturbable. One afternoon, out of idle curiosity, or perhaps a deeper need to know the shape of the man she had let into her life, Mary Beth followed Elias as he walked the edge of his territory. He led her up a faint game trail past a stand of pines, and the mountain opened to them with the plainness of a place that had no patience for pretense. He moved easily among the trees, pointing out bark that had been bitten by rodents, a broken limb that showed the passage of a season. He found a place where two stones fit like hands and sat, placing his pack between them with a care that suggested ritual. He told her in small pieces about his father, a man who had used control where instruction should have been, shaping a boy with the force of fear rather than the patient method of teaching. Elias did not soften the story with complaint. He simply set it down like a tool laid aside.
He was learning that fear could be unlearned by repetition of a different lesson, a calmer, steadier hand that did not hit when mistakes were made. "I never had a book in my house until I was out learning to be a man," he said. "My father's language was mostly earn it or leave. Where I come from, words were like small coins. You did not waste them, and if you had them, you kept them for the right time." Mary Beth listened. Her own history had its abuses, but of a quieter sort. Jeers that cut like small knives, the steady erasure in public of her personhood. She understood how some hurts do not open like wounds, but harden like a sheath around the heart. She had learned to breathe around that hardness. Now, seeing Elias set down the memory as if arranging it for inspection, she felt a kinship not because their injuries were the same, but because each had been shaped by a voice that had tried to define them. "Words can be kind," she said softly. "They can be tools, too. You keep them now." She did not say it as consolation, but as fact. She watched him as he rolled the phrase on his tongue, "Words can be kind," and saw the man absorb it as if it landed on water and did not sink. They returned to the inn and to their slate and chalk. The letters marched on, and Elias learned to spell small nouns: cat, dog, man. He began to read aloud from the primer with a grainy confidence. Mary Beth corrected gently. Short A, sound the consonant, and he obeyed as if learning to obey the rules of a game that produced pleasure. The motions of the hand and mouth aligned. Small things eased. A direction followed at the post. A note left unread no longer mysterious. Yet not all progress came without cost. When Elias began to put words together into sentences he wanted to practice on paper, his writing was a rough thing, uneven and earnest. He tried to sign his name once, and after the awkwardness of making the letters, pushed the slate away in embarrassment at their illegibility. The motion struck Mary Beth with a tenderness that made her want to study him with a hand. She taught him the curve of E, the sweep of Elias's letters, the way to set the ink so it did not blot. He tried and failed times enough that the inn's back shadows were a map of small erasures. That winter, the two of them settled into a rhythm that made the inn feel fuller and less empty. Guests began to arrive with their own stories: a widow who needed biscuit dough, a man with a sore back who needed his saddle mended, and both Mary Beth and Elias met them with a competence that warmed the room. Their combined presence altered the inn's air. Strangers found themselves slipping into long pauses and telling stories they once kept to chests. The inn became, in the small ways of frontier life, a place where people were cared for, and where a person's past did not necessarily define their future.
One evening, when the lanterns burned low and the inn's talk softened into more personal recounting, Mary Beth cleared the table and found a scrap of paper tucked beneath a saucer. The handwriting was a child's slope. The letters were a little nervous. On it was scrawled, in a mixture of pride and uncertainty, E. Boone read the word cat. She smiled in a way that felt like a secret blessing. Elias sat nearby, his jaw set as he read a line from the primer under his breath. He met her eyes and gave a small nod, the kind that acknowledged a shared fact rather than a pronouncement. In the corner, someone clapped lightly, not in mockery, but in a community's way of noting small achievements. And yet, even as warmth established itself, the town's currents shifted. There were looks exchanged over rails. Mrs. Kelton said something under her breath that made the hair stand up on Mary Beth's arm. Thomas Whitmore's presence at the inn grew more frequent and more pointed. He would lean into her orbit with a dangerous, flippant interest, trying to unbalance the careful, private life she had sketched. One night, after closing and with the wind dying into a long, tired hush, Mary Beth sat with the journal on her knees. She wrote a single sentence, and then, without looking, tore the page and folded it into a small square. The sentence read, "To teach a man to read is to teach him to carry himself." She felt, as she wrote, a trembling in her chest she had not entirely named. There was affection in the room, a soft thing that landed between the two of them in mundane gestures, the way Elias warmed her hands without asking, how he once fixed the loose tread on the kitchen chair, how Mary Beth had learned the particular tilt of his smile when he was pleased. There was also fear, the fear of being seen and then reshaped by other people's postures, the fear of being made an example, of having their tender commerce translated into cheap talk over mugs of ale. That fear would not be settled in a single lesson, nor in a single season. It lingered, a low thrumming in the walls of Crow's Rest. People are good at turning a change into spectacle, and then calling it progress. Mary Beth knew, sitting by the stove with her pen stub in the light, that their quiet joy could be turned into gossip and then into rumor. She folded the scrap into her sleeve and went to bed. Outside, the wind eased for the moment, bringing with it the smell of thawing earth and wood smoke. Inside the inn,
A lesson paused at the edge of a question. If a man could learn to read, whatever changes might follow. If a woman who had been measured and dismissed could teach and be loved, what might the town do with that narrative? They were, both of them, beginning to trade in a language that ran deeper than the town's shorthand. They did not yet know the shape of the consequences. They only knew the work in front of them. Letters to learn, pies to bake, paths to clear.
They knew, inexorably and simply, that they were each becoming someone other than what the town had labeled them, and that the change was both a gift and an invitation to trouble. They did not yet know the shape of the consequences. They only knew the work in front of them. Letters to learn, pies to bake, paths to clear. They were, both of them, beginning to trade in a language that ran deeper than the town's shorthand. Spring moved in crooked and late that year, and with the thaw came a shift in the town's attention. The inn's planking steamed in the first warm mornings, and the smell of wet wool and wood sap came through the kitchen window. Snow melt ribboned down the lane and carried with it stories that had been waiting under the ice. The rumor of a mountain man learning to read, the notion of an innkeeper's daughter close at hand to instruct him. Where once ears had perked for the sound of a pie coming from the oven, now they turned to the small private miracle, like men watching for a fox to appear at a henhouse. Mary Beth learned how gossip lands like weather. There were days when it arrived soft, in the form of a neighbor asking casually if Elias would be back for supper. There were days when it struck like flung gravel. One morning, while kneading dough, she felt the door open and closed like a latch in the back of her throat. Thomas Whitmore stood on the threshold with a grin that had been honed by practice. He leaned against the doorframe, not asking permission to be there. "Thought I'd see the school in session," he said loud enough for the few early customers to hear. His friends, predictable as gulls, clustered and let their laughter fill the room. It was not a cruel roar this time. It was the precise, flattened sound of people expecting a spectacle. Elias, who had been at a table with his slate, set his palm flat and kept his head lowered. He had learned to make himself small when storms hovered. Mary Beth felt the old heat that rose before, but this time it did not claim her as holy. There was a steadiness, a muscle built from the dozens of small mornings she had taught letters and kept plates from clattering. She moved across the room and set the loaf on the board with deliberate calm. "We're doing our work," she said. Her voice was even. The words were a plank laid across turning water. Thomas's laugh was a small, sharp thing. "Your work? Teaching the mountain to read? What next? Teaching rocks to dance?" Several heads turned. Elias's hand tightened around his slate. He could have used force. He could have shown Thomas scars, his wildness, the long hours in the pines. Instead, he watched Mary Beth, and she watched him. And in that watching, there was an economy of trust. She would not be baited, and he would not be humiliated by prods. A truer, quieter power held. "Tell your story somewhere else," Mary Beth said. There was no fire in it, only the authority of someone who does necessary chores and will not be bullied from them. For a moment, Thomas looked like a man whose script had been interrupted. He left with a parting grin, the sort practiced for exits, and the inn returned to the small noises of work. But the town had a habit of finding edges and probing them until they frayed. Mrs. Kelton's comments grew bolder. A scrap of a remark in the market could turn into a ledger of insinuation. Mary Beth had picked the mountain man's bones clean of honor. Elias was in her debt and ought to pay it. Mary Beth's mother, usually a quiet and steady presence, received a note slipped under her door suggesting impropriety. For every ally who nodded at the inn's hearth, there were two who tutted behind their hands. The friction built into a choice Mary Beth made one damp evening. The lessons, she decided, would be slowed, not stopped, but slowed and moved mostly to when the inn was quiet. She told Elias, gently, that while she would continue to help him, she feared being careless and offering him something that might be turned into gossip and then into injury. Her voice trembled just enough to tell him she was afraid for him and for herself. Elias listened with the look of a man who had weathered 100 changes and counted them without complaint. He had not expected the town to bless their work. He had, in the back of a mind made cautious by his father's hardened lessons, assumed the world would remain a place of meager favors and guarded hands. But he had also begun to believe in the small claim of his own personhood, enough that he would not allow it to be reduced through another's whispered ledger. "You'll not stop me," he said simply. "I don't want you blamed," Mary Beth replied. "If they think—" "They will think what they think," Elias interrupted.
but the edge in his voice did not carry malice. It carried a steadier force. "I'm tired of being judged for things I didn't choose, but I'm not a thing you hide behind." She heard his truth, and it struck a chord. Mary Beth had thought herself the keeper and protector, handing out the tool of letters like a lifeboat in secret. Elias had not asked her to keep him secret. He wanted to be whole in the town's view, even if that wholeness might draw scorn. The thought unsettled her because it asked her to risk the safety she had built and to show the person she was teaching as an equal, not an object of charity. "Then we'll keep with it," she said, "but if things sour, we'll adjust." He smiled with something like relief, and the decision set them both on a small collision course with the town's appetite for stories. Not every story in Crow's Rest turned sour. Mr. Jameson, a steady-handed carpenter, brought his boy for a meat pie and came away impressed by Elias's careful chair-mending.
Sarah Chin, who ran the small apothecary on the lane, brought herbs for Mary Beth, and without preamble, expressed gratitude for the letters she had shown Elias, and how they had helped him read a new tincture label for a customer. These small, practical acknowledgments mattered far more than the loud talk of the market. They were stitches that held, while gossip frayed. Still, the whispers found their ways to more pointed places. One afternoon, a paper, folded and passed behind the counter, landed where Mary Beth found it. The words inside were less a question than an accusation. "What's the price of your kindness?" It was signed anonymously, the sort of cowardly punctuation of tongues that prefer to wound from the dark. Mary Beth pressed the scrap to the palm of her hand and did not let her face betray how much the small cruelty stung. That night, Elias came in with a small parcel, a stout bundle wrapped in oiled cloth. He set it on the table and opened it with the careful motions of someone who had learned to treat small things as sacred. Inside were lengths of leather, hand-sewn by him, and a crude band of cedar he had carved to fit a finger. "For when we be joined," he said, not elaborate, but honest. He had been learning with his hands as much as with his head, whittling wood into a ring, smoothing the edges until it fit cleanly on his finger. Mary Beth held the cedar band and felt the steady geometry of his thought, action that word only confirmed. She had not expected him to be quick with sentiment. He had never been that sort of man. But the ring was more than a token. It was a practical vow. He had made something that would last, something that could be repaired. In that, for the two of them, there was the language of a future. "Marry me," he said then, not on his knees nor with flowery speech, but with the small, fierce simplicity that marked so much of him. It was a sentence both practiced and raw. The confession caught Mary Beth off guard. She had imagined that love might arrive as a slow, mutual accretion, a habit of comfort. But confession, once spoken, turns waiting into an immediate decision. She understood then that they had already been married to chores that bound them, the stove and the bread and the midnight watch of a child's fever. Yet the naming of it made other things possible, the sharing of a bed without apology, the standing together in front of the town. "I can't promise you it will be easy," she said, and the small candidness of it was not a refusal. She looked at the cedar ring in her hand and then at the man who had brought it. "I don't want easy," Elias said. "I want right." So they promised themselves to attempt right. It was not a theatrical proposal, and it would not be a town pageant wedding. They planned a small ceremony under the pines on the ridge, where the mountain could be witness, and the town would be invited but not obliged to understand. Mary Beth's mother sewed a simple dress from an old bolt of dark cloth, trimming it with a strip of lace that had once belonged to Mary Beth's grandmother. Mr. Jameson carved a small box to hold their wedding rings. Sarah Chin offered sprigs of herbs to tuck in their coats. These gifts were measured and practical, each bearing careful intention rather than noise. There were preparations that did not need mention but nonetheless held weight. Mary Beth worried over a seat. Elias practiced writing his name in a firm hand because he wanted to sign his vows cleanly. They baked a bread to share with the town, round, heavy, the sort that carries blessing by its weight. The dress, the ring, the bread, each was a list of small labors that stitched two lives together. On the morning of the wedding, a thin blue smoke rose from the inn's chimney, and the sky was mercy clear. The ridge held the new light like a hand cupping the town. Guests came in soberly, some because they respected the couple, others out of curiosity, a few not invited but showing up as Crow's Rest had a habit of doing. Mrs. Kelton was not among them, a deliberate absence that said more than any cruel remark. Thomas Whitmore arrived but kept his distance,
as if seeing would be its own punishment. The ceremony was a plain, unadorned thing. A friend from the town said a few words, not about fate nor providence, but about how two people who can teach each other must be considered fortunate. Mary Beth's voice trembled as she read a short passage she had written in a scrawled hand and tucked into the fold of her sleeve. "We teach one another how to stay." It was not a display of poetry so much as a vow in the everyday grammar that had always shaped her life. Elias read aloud, his voice steady, and when Mary Beth gave him her hand to hold, there was no grand speech to follow, only the small gravity of two people who had learned to rely on each other's competence. After the ceremony, the town's eyes did what eyes often do. They shifted. Some softened with the sight of simple fidelity, others remained unreadable. The dinner that followed was an ordinary feast of roasted meat, dumplings, and a slab of pie that passed from plate to plate. Children chased one another among the pines, while elders exchanged the small talk of the comfortable. For a few hours, Crow's Rest was simply a place where neighbors shared a meal and did not divide their acts into heroism and scandal. In the private hours after guests dwindled, when the sky had sealed itself like a bowl and the hush of night fell heavy, Mary Beth and Elias sat with their hands knit together and the small cedar band on her finger. The ring smelled faintly of sap and earth. They spoke quietly, not of grandeur but of the practicalities that stitch a life: how to keep accounts for the inn, how to mend a roof before a storm, where to keep blank paper for small journals.
They spoke in the language they had always practiced, the exchange of things that make daily life possible. The months that followed were ordinary in the way that matter most. The inn became two people's work, and the work returned both to them a new sort of wealth, companionship as an ordinary currency. Elias continued to learn. His writing grew less like the scratch of a hunted thing and more like the deliberate carving of a man's hand. The letters lined up, then formed words, and then, sometime in the first year of their marriage, a sentence. He wrote in a journal that Mary Beth had given him, a fresh, bound set of pages. At first, his entries were sparse, cataloging what a man in the mountain notices: cut wood, fixed chair, snow melted. Over time, his notes broadened. He started recording what they learned together. Told Mary Beth, "You teach me." She laughed. We shared bread. In the margins, he drew simple pictures: a bowl, a boot, a small house with smoke from the chimney. It was not eloquence. It was a life accounted for. Their son came in a winter vaster than any before, and they named him Hope, because they could not think of a finer anchor for a child born into a world they had remade. The birth was a clean labor of small hands and older women. Mary Beth's mother and Sarah Chin were present, the latter with a warm poultice and quiet authority. Elias held Mary's hand and later cradled the child as if he were a fragile thing that would learn to be sturdier in the shelter of two competent arms. Hope was a quiet boy at first, then not at all. He had his father's mouth and his mother's stubborn calm. He learned early to be read to. Elias, who had once flinched at the sight of a book, sat in the low chair by the kitchen stove and read to his son. At first it was the primer, then short tales Mary Beth kept in her journal of small moments. Hope laughed when the dog chased the kettle. Elias read aloud with a voice that had been rough and steady, but now held a gentleness that belonged to someone who had known how to build trust by the hour. His pronunciation still caught on certain words, but the cadence was true, and his small hands would pat the cage as if to hold it secure. In the years that followed, letters multiplied into more than instruction. Elias began to keep a second journal, not just of chores, but of intentions to his son. He wrote in the crude, earnest hand he had labored to perfect. The pages were often simple. Hope, learn the trail. Learn the names of stars. Learn to fix what breaks. On certain nights, he would take a pen and write a longer note, and Mary Beth would find these tucked inside a book. When you are older, use words to open doors, but not to close hearts. They were the sort of lines a father gives when he has been given the honor to make a life safer. Mary Beth continued to write, her journal filled with entries that were not merely lists, but reflections on the slow architecture of love. She kept a torn page that read, "He wrote my name and it fits like a garment." It was private, and yet when she read it again, she found a modest courage in those words. that she had taught not only letters but a way for a man to see himself as capable of language and therefore capable of declaring his affection. The inn evolved into a place where learning came naturally. Elias set up a small shelf with primers and blank paper, and children of the town would stop to sit and trace letters with the slate. Mary Beth organized impromptu sessions, not just for Elias now, but for youngsters who came with hesitant curiosity. Mr. Jameson, seeing the change, offered spare wood to make more slates. Sarah Chin donated a set of old primers she had kept for odds and ends. The little corner by the stove became an informal school, where the small noise of pencils against paper sounded like the town's new pulse. Not all were quick to accept this small revolution. Mrs. Kelton continued to lodge complaints when the inn's noise rose too much. Thomas Whitmore made his barbed remarks and attempted later to charm his way into prominence by adopting a patronizing familiarity with the couple. But their words had less power now. People had seen Elias sign a lease, deliver a note to the store, and read the market rates aloud in the square. They had seen Mary Beth stand steady at the ledger and sign for supplies without flinching. The town measured by acts more than by cheap words, and acts are often the teacher people cannot ignore. There were still rough nights. Elias sometimes woke to nightmares that left the taste of past blows on his breath. Mary Beth would find him at the window, hands pressed to the pane as if to steady the world. When he confessed fragments of his past, the way his father had taught with hardness rather than patience, he did so sparsely, never embellishing the violence but letting the memory show its scar. They tended one another's wounds in practical ways. Mary Beth set a steady routine for nights when Elias's sleep frayed. Elias, when Mary Beth doubted her worth after an unkind remark in the market, would press his forehead to hers and say simply, "You are more than their measure." The measure of their life became less about being seen and more about seeing. Elias learned to read and then to write with the intent to be present. Mary Beth learned to accept herself as a person worthy of love beyond the narrow taxonomy that the town had once offered. The roles the title suggested, mountain man and overweight girl, became depictions of what the town had said once, not of who they were now. The name Overweight was a memory of the town's shorthand rather than a descriptor of Mary Beth's identity. She was an innkeeper, a teacher, a mother, a wife. She was the woman who taught letters and who had the steadiness to hold a life together. In time, they built a small study at the back of the inn, a place with a window that looked toward the ridge and a shelf of bound journals. Elias kept his 2 journals there, one for lists, one for longer thoughts. Mary Beth kept a folio of her own writing, notes and small essays about the quiet pride of making and mending, the joy of a child reading his first word. Hope, who grew into a bright, energetic boy, added his scratches and pictures to the margins. The study became more than storage for language. It was a place where the family recorded the slow, accumulating evidence of life. As years moved on, Elias took on more responsibility in town matters. When the postman needed help in deep snow, Elias, who once would have been the subject of rumor for his mountain ways, took the route with a reliable pace. When a widow needed a new latch, he mended it without fuss. These small acts knit him into the community at a practical level that words alone would not have accomplished. Even those who had been most inclined to scorn began to treat him with courtesy, if not without the memory of their earlier opinion. Courtesy, once offered, has a sly way of growing into respect. Mary Beth, too, found new ease. She stopped needing to hide the books beneath the bed. She kept her journal in the study where others might find it, and be encouraged by a small line about a learned letter or a child's triumph. Once, when a young woman came to the inn asking for work and confessed she had been mocked for her looks, Mary Beth offered a spare primer and a gentle smile. "Words are portable," she told her. "They may not change what others think, but they change what you know." The town's landscape of judgment softened as new stories supplanted old. Children, folded into the routine of lessons, grew to accept that hands could teach what mouths had once dismissed. Hope learned to read before he could be counted among the town's boys. He read for pleasure and for instruction, passing along the small treasures he discovered to friends at play. He learned to press his face into a page and to lose himself in the feel of a sentence that unwound into something like surprise. Time made other changes, subtle and sweet. Elias's hand steadied enough to write cleanly on the edge of a ledger. Once, when a traveling merchant came through with a scrap of news, a distant brother had sent word asking after the mountain's family, Elias sat down and wrote a careful letter. His spelling was not elegant, but the sentences were clear and sincere. He posted it with the help of the town post, and watched the ink dry like a small rite. The act of sending a letter, of using words to reach across space, was a measure of how far he had come. Mary Beth occasionally revisited the memory of the market square when her face had been the butt of a cruel jest, but those times no longer held the dominion they once had.
She had a husband who spoke her name with care, a son who thrummed with questions, and a town that had learned, slowly, to take them as they were. She kept her old journal page that said, "I teach because I remember what it felt like to be unseen." She did not need to hide that page in the dark anymore. She could leave it on the study table, as a quiet testament. As for Thomas Whitmore, his sharpness blunted over time in the face of the community's evolving routines. He continued to look for sport in other people's discomfort, but found fewer willing partners. Once, in a rare moment of awkward honesty, he offered Elias a handshake in the inn's doorway, half an apology and half a test. Elias took it without spectacle, and that small exchange reduced the long sharpness of Thomas's jokes by degrees. People are slow to change, but small acts of decency, when repeated, add up. Years later, when Hope was old enough to compass his father's path along the ridge, and old enough to be taught the names of certain stars, Elias sat with the boy and read aloud from his own childhood primer. They drank cocoa in the late afternoon light, and Elias read slowly, sounding out the words as a man who had first made meaning from scratch. Sometimes he would stop and point to his own hand as he wrote letters in the dust. "This is where the hand begins," he would say. Hope, with all a child's certain confidence, would try and then correct his strokes with a fascinating seriousness. In quiet hours, Elias took to writing letters to Hope that were not lists nor instructions, but small pieces of advice folded like maps. He wrote of the value of steady work and of kindness, of how to treat tools and people with similar care. He wrote of errors he had made and what he had learned, not so much repentance as clear, blunt instruction. If someone laughs at you, he wrote in one note, study them for a time. See what they are afraid of. Often they fear for reasons that have nothing to do with you. He gave these notes to Mary Beth to hide in Hope's pockets when the boy went off to the ridge. Mary Beth aged into a kindly patience that suited her. She kept the inn like a seamstress keeps a kid stitch, visible, dependable. Her body held the quiet of a woman who had endured the sting of public mockery, and then, by slow repetition of necessary tasks and the acceptance of herself as worthy, made the sting less urgent. She was not an object of the town's ridicule any longer, but a woman whose labor and care had a visible currency. Their legacy was not a grand edifice, but a field of steady small acts. Elias took it upon himself as he grew older to teach any willing townsman to read. He set aside mornings for the boys at the general store who wanted to be able to read a ledger, afternoons for women who wanted to learn the names of their herbs. He taught by the method that had served him, patient correction, the insistence on small rhythms, the encouragement of repeated practice.
He was not an eloquent teacher, but he was an honest one, with the sincerity that invites trust rather than pretense. Mary Beth's instruction turned into an informal school of its own. She wrote small primers for residents who wanted to learn labels, then longer lessons on how to compose a letter. She taught with a hands-on insistence. Write to someone once a week, she'd tell those new at the craft. Practice keeps the letters from going to rust. The town slowly adapted to the presence of people who could now sign their names with confidence and send notes that had a warmth previously absent. When Elias grew older and his hair showed touches of the gray that had once rimmed his scars, he would sit by the hearth and read aloud from the journal he had kept since the first shaky letters. He read small lines to Hope and to anyone who asked, about wood that split unexpectedly, about a winter's kindness, about the way a woman had offered him a primer and then, in the most practical of ways, taught him to be seen. Their son grew up and, as such things go, left for seasons to learn a trade and returned richer for the wider world. He would come back with pockets full of curious things, a small tool from a distant town, a book of unfamiliar tales, and the family would gather to share the new knowledge. The house at the inn felt full, sometimes too crowded with laughter and cooking, and Mary Beth loved every inch of it. In the quiet of late nights, when the inn's lamp drew small pools in the rooms and the world quieted to the sound of breathing and settling wood, Mary Beth and Elias would sit together with a book between them. They read aloud to one another sometimes, their voices crossing like threads, each correcting the other's passage when a word proved stubborn. There was an intimacy in that mild correction, the shared gesture of two people who had begun their marriage in small lessons
and had continued in a life made up of the same patient repetitions. Elias's hand, once crude with chalk and uncertain with ink, had become the hand that wrote a clear line for his son's school application. The letters were not flourished, but they were strong enough. He did not boast, he recorded. He left notes on the table for Mary Beth, bought nails, fed the dog. He left longer letters for Hope before his departures. Travel slow, learn the names of the land. Mary Beth's journal swelled with entries that were not apologies, but small victories. She kept that torn page, "I teach because I remember what it felt like to be unseen," as a talisman. Sometimes when she looked at it late at night, she would smile in that private way of people who have been hardened by trial and softened by company. She would read further and find that the weight of being seen had become less a hunger and more a settled state. She had taught a man to read, yes, but more importantly, she had taught a community a small habit of attention.
Toward the end of his life, Elias would sit by the window in the study and teach a young cousin how to tie a rope knot. His beard was wider, and his hands bore the slow map of years, but he retained the directness that had first endeared him to Mary Beth. Once, when a neighbor asked him in admiration how he had learned such patience, Elias pointed with a thumb toward the shelf of primers and the cedar band she had made for him. "She taught me letters," he said plainly. "Learning to read taught me to be patient with others, and her love taught me to be patient with myself." On a cold evening that resembled the first night the storm had brought Elias into the inn, the town gathered around the Cooper hearth. Snow lay outside like a waiting thing, bright and unjudging. The inn pulsed with people sharing songs and stories. Hope, grown and steady, read aloud from a book he had found on a long trip. Elias listened, with the familiar small curve of contentment at his mouth. Mary Beth sat beside him, her hand finding his, and the world felt both new and continuous. They did not pretend the past had not been hard. They kept the scars and the old pages as evidence of lessons learned. There were nights when Elias's fingers fumbled, forgetting a letter for a moment, and Mary's voice would correct him with the same tenderness she had always used. They were not a picture of perfection, but of relentless, patient repair. When Elias at last grew quiet and his breath slowed like low tide, Mary Beth held his hand and read aloud the last notes from his journal. They were not grand nor boastful, only simple entries. Snow late, Hope learned to tie a knot, coffee good. She read them as if they were prayers, small precisions of a life tightly loved. After he was gone, the town remembered him in many ways, as the mountain man who had once feared a book and then learned to bind a life with ink and paper, as Elias Boone, who taught other men to read with the same blunt firmness he'd used to teach himself. Mary Beth, for her part, continued in the work she had always done. The inn remained, and the study shelf held his journals like a small congregation. Hope, now father himself in turn, would sit with the family by the hearth and read from the primers that had once done so much quiet work. The world seemed, at times, to narrow to the small miracle of letters. They had not mountains moved, nor had they wrought miracles beyond the practical realm. They had built a life that taught people to see themselves in more than a single sentence. Literacy had become a courtesy, a tool, a kind of dignity. In the end, the town's shorthand softened because people had learned to measure one another by the steadiness of their hands and the care of their actions. Mary Beth's body, once the subject of a cruel joke, was no longer an easy shorthand for judgment. She was, in common acknowledgement, the woman who taught letters, who kept a ledger honest, who made an inn into a place hospitable to learning and love. The label of the town had once used to belittle her seemed small and outdated in the face of a life lived plainly and surely. On a winter evening not unlike the first, snow arriving again like careful ash, Mary Beth sat with Hope and his little daughter on her lap. They read from a book Elias had once practiced with, turning pages with the slow reverence of people who understand how fragile meaning can be. Outside, the world kept its small cruelties, but inside they had learned to tend one another. The little girl's finger traced the letters, and Hope corrected the tilt of her wrist in the patient, exact way he had learned from a man who had once not read at all. Mary Beth put her hand to the page and then to her chest and felt the slow, steady beat of a life that had been hard won. She thought of the first night the mountain man had come in, of the way his hands had trembled at a falling book. She thought of the cedar ring and the way they had pledged one another in the plainest terms. She thought of the many small lessons: how to hold chalk, how to fold a letter, how to look at a person until their outline ceased to be caricature and became simply another human being. In the light of the lamp, with the snow and untroubled hush beyond the window, Mary Beth mouthed a simple line she had written years before and never thrown away. It had grown new meaning over the decades. To teach a man to read is to teach him to carry himself. The sentence had once been a private defiance, and now it was the ordinary truth of their house. When the little girl yawned and Hope tucked her into a blanket, Mary Beth rose and went to the study where Elias's journals lived. She opened one at random and read a page. Hope climbed the ridge, found a feather. He laughed. The handwriting was the same, plain and steady, and Mary Beth felt the old warmth of gratitude bloom like a steady embers. She closed the book and set it back, knowing that these small pages would outlast many of the larger proclamations that towns and gossip offered. Outside, the snow fell as if without aim, and inside the inn glowed. The mountain man who had not once known how to read had grown into a father, a teacher, a man whose hand could sign a letter and whose voice could steady a child. The woman who the town had once measured by an unkind jest had become the center of a life defined by learning, care, and the quiet courage of steady work. If this story reached you in a way that warmed something small within, consider sharing it with someone who might need a reminder that patience, teaching, and being seen can change a life.